Well, we'll talk about that with David Davis, former Brexit Secretary, still a Conservative MP. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. I do want to talk about that, but first I was going to ask you about migrant boats. You've been a senior figure in the Conservative Party for a very long time. You know as well as I do that on the doorsteps this is a huge issue, not just for Tory voters, for Labour voters, particularly those former Labour voters in those crucial red wall seats that delivered that age-strong majority in 2019. This plan, published tomorrow, a bill, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, and Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, they want to not only make sure that channel migrants are removed from Britain, are detained if they arrive and removed from Britain and unable to claim asylum, but it's revealed today, banned for life from claiming asylum under this law to be published tomorrow. Do you think there is any chance at all that this will become law and then be enacted and actually happen?
I think it'll almost certainly become law and will at least start to happen. The difficulty is the practicalities. I mean, you may have seen in the papers this morning that Priti Patel has criticised it, and it looks, if it's as described, it looks as though it's in breach of the UN Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention, which we wrote as well as signed. It'll cause all sorts of difficulties. Just imagine for a second an Afghan who was perhaps a translator for the British Army, stuck in Afghanistan, wants to get out and get here, and we haven't rescued him. He gets a false identity to go to Pakistan or Iran, one of the neighbouring countries. He then gets a criminal to bring him here. He's going to be excluded, indeed banned for 10 years if he comes across the channel. Now, that's not right. And I think what will happen is that some holes will appear in this. And then in addition to all of that, they say, well, they're going to be locked up. Well, where? I mean, at the moment, there's a name being thrown around, or the place being thrown around, is Rwanda. We still haven't got anybody to Rwanda. The odds are it'll maximise out at about 3,000. That's a month or so's traffic in this. So there are real practical issues. So we'll have to see what comes up in the details tomorrow.
Well, that's the thing. It's easy to, I mean, we understand they've been working on the details, and Rishi Sunak is very much a details man, very different from his, certainly his predecessor but one in Boris Johnson. And that does...
I think his predecessors, I'm afraid.
Exactly, yes. That does make a very big difference. However, we know that the legal challenges, as you say, they are going to be huge across the board. They're going to be numerous, very, very expensive. We'll be paying for both sides because we'll be paying government costs and indeed legal aid costs as well. We know there is this the issue of the asylum seekers, and we also know that there isn't really a legal route for most people to come to the UK other than this illegal route, unless you're from Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and that's a very small number, or Ukraine. I'm still trying to help an Afghanistan translator who was on my show, help him get out of Afghanistan and come to this country. I mean, not getting anywhere at all with that. There aren't legal routes for an awful lot of people, in which case they say, well, these people are desperate, they have to do this, we don't know, we can't verify whether people are genuine asylum seekers or not. The reality is the legal challenges could take this going. This could take years before anyone leaves. You've got a general election May, June 2024, just next year. Do you think this is likely to be resolved? Do you think there's going to be a single person taking off on a plane to Rwanda or anywhere else before the next general election?
Well, it'll be nip and tuck, frankly. I suspect the legal cases will eventually ground out sometime next spring, but it's risky. And one of the things that concerns me, I mean, I don't know if you remember, I wrote to the Prime Minister along with 50 other MPs before Christmas about this and said, you can actually pass a 2-page bill simply stating that a number of countries, most notably Albania, are a safe country and can be sent straight back to Albania, and they could have done that months ago, and they haven't done that. They said they've not invented here, they want to invent their own solution. So my concern is there are some simple answers to this. Don't completely solve the problem, but dramatically reduce it. And they haven't taken those answers.
But we are looking at such huge numbers. We're talking about 45,000 arriving last year. Could be 100,000 this year. We're already looking at a £3 billion cost to process asylum claims and house and feed these people. That's going to double by another £3 billion. I mean, these are huge sums of money, and these are people that, frankly, most people in the British public don't want in this country.
Well, that's right. But even, look, the public itself differentiates. It differentiates between, let's take the extreme examples, an Albanian who's clearly just coming. Albania is a safe country. It's got fewer references to the European Court than we have. So, they're coming here in order to get a better life. I mean, can't really blame them for that, but they're coming here just for economic reasons. And you compare that with your Afghan translator. The British public, as you've seen with their treatment of Ukrainians, are very compassionate about people with a real need. And any law that doesn't actually differentiate is going to fail on legal, practical, all sorts of grounds. And that's why I say we'll look at the detail, but on the basis of the headlines this morning, this one's not going to work.
OK, well, then that way we'll have issues, won't it? Let me ask you about a couple of other big stories in the news. Obviously, these lockdown files we're just discussing, and so many of the revelations we've seen. I mean, the summary of it is really the government frighten the living daylights out of us. I think the phrase frighten the pants off us, as the words of Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, to get us to comply with lockdowns. They then kind of got stuck in this cycle of trying to justify their actions, not get ahead of public opinion, not come out of lockdowns or be forced into lockdowns, even when it would appear Boris Johnson was apparently thinking he didn't want them. Well, on one day, the next day he would want them. I mean, and that loads of the decision-making was not based on the science, as they kept claiming, CAP-S, but actually on ego, on reputation, on not wanting to look like you got things wrong before. People were forced to, as we revelations on the front page today, there was scientific evidence that you didn't need to isolate for 14 days or 10 days. You could isolate for just 5 days. If you took a test every day, you could be out and about if you'd been in contact with someone who'd had COVID. But no, they decided not to take it down to 5 days because that would imply that the government had been getting it wrong, as opposed to acknowledging, actually, it turns out the latest evidence is this. A total disregard for facts, for data, for scientific evidence in favour of protecting ego, reputation, furthering careers, and, frankly, a load of willy-waving by a bunch of middle-aged men, David Davis. What do you make of those reports?
Well, first off, I'm not surprised about the lack of scientific basis. We saw quite a lot of this early on. I mean, you may remember, I wrote about it, Neil Ferguson's forecasts were treated as facts when they weren't. They were fantasy, and all the way through this, there's been, I'll be frank with you, Whitehall generally, not just Matt Hancock, Whitehall generally is really crap at handling science and technology. It's just no good at it. Indeed, the Prime Minister today is has found it necessary to announce, we're going to enlarge on our capability in science and technology because we're not much, as a government, not just our government, any government in the last 50 years is poor at it. So you got that problem. Secondly, literally since March 23rd, 2020, when we had the Coronavirus Emergency Act, we effectively crippled Parliament. We effectively gave all these powers to these ministers to, as you say, willy-wave with them. And that was the outcome. Indeed, you may not know, in fact, nobody knows it, I think, that I asked for all of the data they gathered in terms of focus groups and opinion polls. The government back in 2020 spent more money than any previous government on opinion polls and focus groups. And you have to wonder why. What were they doing? So I asked them, can you publish them, please? And they've refused. For 2 years, they categorically refused.
Sorry, so the government spent our money, huge amounts of money, millions, on this data, and they have refused a former cabinet minister's request to publish what information they got. Are they allowed to do that?
Well, I did it. I did two ways because there was a difficult. I did it through FOI, Freedom of Information Request, and we went right through the process, and we failed on that. They said, "Oh, too expensive, secret, all this. How can an opinion poll be secret?" But there we are. And I also tried in Parliament, and they keep saying, "Oh, sometime soon, sometime soon." The last time I asked was last September, and they said, "Oh, we'll let you know by Christmas." Well, we haven't seen it yet. Yeah. So I shall raise that in the House this afternoon, just to make.
Yes, I know you should. And this is the thing: does it matter? Well, it does matter because there's loads of evidence from these WhatsApps that they were being driven not by data in terms of the science or the R number or whatever. Their policies were being driven by what people thought, what the media thought, the demands for lockdowns at press conferences. Again, driven by their scare tactics from the beginning. So they got themselves trapped in this doom cycle of we've told everyone that we need it's terrible and we're all going to die and we need to lock down or everyone will die. And then, so what a surprise, people demand lockdowns. And then when they're in them, huge numbers of people, according to their polling, we understand, didn't want them to come out of lockdown. There's one message for Boris Johnson over the weekend where he's saying, they can't get ahead of public opinion. I mean, but the thing that amazes me about this, David, is that it's blatantly obvious now. These messages, look, we know these messages are genuine. We know how decision-making was being made. And even with the best will in the world, when people say, well, they weren't sure what they were doing in March 2020. Actually, most of the information we've got about the virus, we did know in March 2020. But even if you're forgiving on that front, by 2021, the fact that they are still making so many terrible decisions for the wrong reasons, and yet people are not angry. So many people still think that lockdowns were the right thing to do. What do you make of that?
Well, that's what happens with herd views, I'm afraid. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's interesting in some of this and I do sympathise to some extent in 2020. I can see why they were terrified. But what's interesting is what comes out of it is that Boris, for example, was instinctively wanting to liberalise this a bit. And every time he did, I think it was Dominic Cummings, just slapped a focus group or a polling data in front of him and said, no, the public want it. And he gave in. I mean, that's a fairly bad reflection on him too. But nevertheless, he did want to do that. And I'm not surprised that the public weren't terrified, because after all, they're trying to scare the pants off them.
Yeah.
And not just the BBC, most of the conventional media were all doing the same thing. And not just in this country, in virtually the entire world. Look at the trouble that the chief medical officer of Sweden got into for actually keeping Sweden slightly freer than the rest of us.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised at that.
Although their excess mortality, all causes over the entire period, shows that they made the right decision, because they've had very little economic impact. Children didn't miss out on education. They were at school until the age of 16. And they have not seen the same excess deaths that we've seen, because they didn't shut down their health service, etc., etc. Can I just ask you just finally, because time's against us, Partygate and Boris Johnson, he's been back in the news. Sue Gray's appointment by Keir Starmer as his next chief of staff. Is that an appropriate appointment for Sue Gray to have been discussing with him and to have taken, given that she was involved in that Partygate investigation?
Well, I mean, I think Starmer's daft to have done this, in truth, just from a political point of view. Whether it's appropriate will depend entirely on when she started. If she started having this conversation before she concluded some of these reviews, then she's in the wrong, and so is he, for that matter. On the other hand, I'm afraid it makes no difference to Boris's case, because the Privileges Committee will work from the original raw data.
And the facts are the facts. Just finally, Boris Johnson has got 100 people on his resignation honours list. One of those is his own father. He wants him to be Sir Stanley Johnson. Should he?
No. If I was Rishi Sunak, and he will have the final say, I would allow him whatever is the normal average resignation honours. I wouldn't allow him 100. I certainly wouldn't allow him just to put family members on.
Okay.
I mean, it brings the whole thing into disrepute. The House of Lords is now very worried about what's happening to its reputation.
Oh, yes.
It's a very direct result of recent appointments.
David Davis, we'll have to leave it there. So appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much indeed. 8:20 is the time. Up next, Labour's Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. This is Talk Breakfast.